So I got early access to Flins, and he is quite peculiar. And I'm not just talking about the haircut. See, the thing is, this Lightkeeper heavily depends on having another Nod-Krai unit in the team, but because Aino is free, he can pump out some of the best damage in the game with his free-to-play comp and craftable weapon equipped. Not only that, unlike Varessa, whose big burst is not very viable, Flins can in fact utilize both his mini and big burst at the same time. Most important of all, while he can only be played in just one team comp, so a similar restriction that Skirk has, there's a lot of ways you can approach this single team archetype. And yes, even though Ineffa will be his premium teammate, she's not as crucial as Escoffier to Skirk. Long story short, Flint's situation is complicated. But in this Constellation Zero showcase video, I am gonna reveal to you everything you need to know about this premier Lunar-Charged damage dealer, including many team comps and loadouts I've tested, so that you can decide for yourself if he's worth pulling for. Alright, to start off, for the most part of the video, I'll be showcasing Flins with Prospector's Shovel, which is his best free-to-play craftable weapon, while at the same time, he will be using Night of the Sky's Unveiling Artifact set that has attack, crit damage main stats. However, as you'll see later on, ER Sands will be viable as well. And keep in mind, I'll talk about some other weapon and artifact options later in the video. Finally, his talents are raised to level 9, and he is Constellation 0. Oh, and yeah, I am on Creator Experience server, so content shown here is subject to change. Anyway, I think the best way to introduce him is by first taking a look at how he performs without and with another Nod-Krai unit in the team. If he is the only Nod-Krai unit in the team, after doing his full rotation and with all relevant buffs active, he ends up dealing roughly 540,000 damage, and that's including Lunar-Charged reactions he contributed to. That's pretty low. So how about we swap out Kokomi with Aino? Both of them barely contribute any kind of personal damage, so surely the difference won't be that big, right? Oh sure, it's only 2.5 times bigger? What? That's right, he now deals about 1.3 million damage by just following exact same rotation. So what changed? A lot actually. Okay, first of all, as you'll notice, his mini burst deals one more additional, even bigger Lunar-Charged attack, which he can do 2 times while the skill lasts. And the same applies to his big burst. It delivers 2 additional attacks. Not only that, when the team is in Ascendant Gleam state, units who are not from Nod-Krai can grant up to 36% boosted lunar reaction damage. If that's not enough, the Serenade artifact set grants additional 60 elemental mastery, which he cares about, and then his own Night Sky artifact set provides additional 15% critical rate. Oh, and of course, Prospector's Shovel also grants 24% more Lunar-Charged damage increase. Finally, his own first passive ability provides yet another 20% Lunar-Charged reaction damage increase. So, as you can see, he ends up missing out on 7 additional buffs, some of which are extremely crucial, while playing with another Nod-Krai unit. That's insane if you think about it. And moving forward, I am always just gonna talk about his kit and teams and potential, assuming there's at least one other Nod-Krai unit in the team. And I know, there's only 3 other units who can provide Moonsign level for the team: Lauma, Ineffa, and Aino. I'll talk about them all a bit later in the team section. But anyway, let's start from the beginning and take a closer look at Flint's kit. First, we have normal attacks. The physical damage is absolutely pitiful, just like my luck with 50/50s. You will almost never end up dealing damage this way, so I don't even recommend leveling this talent. So instead, let's talk about what really matters, the elemental skill. When you press it, it won't deal initial damage, and instead, Flins gains Electro Infusion and resistance to interruption for 10 seconds. As you'll notice, the skill provides new multipliers for his normal and charge attacks, although sadly, he is probably Child's buddy because he also cannot do plunge attacks while he has the infusion. Now, these attacks every 2 seconds can generate a small electro particle, so at most you can get 5 particles, but on average it's usually about 3 to 5 particles depending on how you use his combos. Still, the damage he causes with his infused electro attacks is quite small and ends up contributing to only about 10% of his total damage. So where does the rest of his damage come from? Well, after tapping the skill initially to enter the electro infusion state, he can tap the skill again to deal a little bit of damage. Usually when fully buffed, it can range between 17 to 20,000 damage. However, and most importantly, his burst will start to glow, and this is where he can consume 30 energy and unleash a mini burst attack, which delivers 2 Lunar-Charged hits that deal massive damage. On average, the first hit can do about 200k, and second hit, which has higher multiplier, will do around 290 to 300k damage. And again, remember, this second hit wouldn't happen if the team wasn't in Ascendant Gleam state, or in other words, if he was the only Nod-Krai unit in the team. But yeah, once the second skill tap is used, it goes into 6-second cooldown, which cannot be reduced by any effects. And when it's ready, you can tap it again and immediately follow up with another mini burst, provided he has at least 30 energy. So, long story short, you tap the skill, gain infusion, tap it again to deal massive damage, then use mini burst immediately to deal 2 huge Lunar-Charged hits, then keep spamming electrofuse and normal attacks, and the moment the skill cooldown is over, tap it again and tap the burst button for another 2 massive Lunar-Charged hits. Now, here's a quick refresher on how Lunar-Charged works. His third passive states that whenever anybody would trigger Electro-Charge reaction, it instead becomes Lunar-Charged, which summons this cloud above the enemy for 8 seconds, and every 2 seconds, provided there's ongoing Hydro and Electro application happening, Lunar-Charge reaction is caused, which can become a critical hit, scales with Elemental Mastery and character's level, ignores enemies' defense, benefits from Resistance Shred, so Electro-Resistance Shred, and most importantly, anyone who applied Hydro or Electro contributes to the reaction, which takes a look at their critical rate and damage, elemental mastery, and level, and then based on that, the first highest damage dealer fully contributes, then second highest, only half of their damage is added, and then the other third and fourth, if any, contribute only 1/12 of their damage. In other words, we can see, for example, once Flins is on the field, Lunar-Charged reaction damage goes up by a lot more because he has the best stats out of everyone in the team. However, the Lunar-Charged damage his mini burst and big burst deal work a little differently because here, only Flint's stats matter, and in addition to everything else that I've mentioned, attack is also added into the damage formula. And this is why you always want to run him with Attack Goblet, because damage percent are not added into Lunar-Charged damage. And in total, his Lunar-Charged damage coming from Mini Burst and Big Burst contribute to about 73% of his total damage. Or basically, by taking a look at this free-to-play team rotation, he deals roughly 1.16 million damage with Lunar-Charged, and only about 150,000 with his skill and infused normal attacks. So yeah, he basically specializes in dealing Lunar-Charged damage. But let's quickly go through his passives. As I said, third passive enables Lunar-Charged reactions, but also, the base damage of Lunar-Charged is increased by 0.7% for every 100 attack Flins has, and this maxes out at 14%, or when he has reached 2000 attack, which will happen naturally with any weapon, to be honest. His second passive takes 8% of his attack and converts it to additional EM, up to 160, which coincidentally also maxes out at 2000 attack. And then finally, his first passive states that whenever the team is in Ascendant Gleam state, which should always be the case, the Lunar-Charged reaction damage caused by Flins is increased by 20%. Alright, with the passives out of the way, let's talk about the final part of his kit, the burst. Obviously, I already mentioned how his mini burst works, which is also located at this part of the kit, but now I want to focus on the big burst. It costs 80 energy and has a long 20-second cooldown, which is not shared together with the mini burst, which is great. And when we take a look at the damage, it initially deals a small hit of regular damage, despite having 441% multiplier. But then, 2 small Lunar-Charged hits descend, each dealing about 43k damage, and then the final big Lunar-Charged hit is delivered, decimating the enemy for roughly 310,000 damage. So if we combine all of this together, this big burst basically ends up dealing about the same amount of damage as the 2 Lunar-Charged hits from the mini burst. So the big question is, why even bother using it? Well, here's the thing. Unlike Veresa's Big Burst, which doesn't really have any use case, Flins can actually utilize both the Big Burst and Small Burst, which I'll just call the Triple Burst playstyle. Let me explain. You see, when Flins is on field, he will keep gaining energy from his own skill and potentially from other teammates who can generate particles periodically, like Ineffa, Fischl, or Cookie. What this means is that after setting up the rotation, and Flins is last in order, you can immediately trigger his Big Burst and then tap the skill to gain the infusion and start building up energy again, since Mini Burst only requires 30 energy, and for him, it's possible to regain this amount of energy, use the Mini Burst, and keep on fighting. Hopefully, he can do this for the second time. But here's one crucial thing I didn't tell you yet. Energy recharge stat requirements. Usually, if the playstyle only revolves around using mini bursts only, it's enough for him to have around 125 to 130% ER, which can be achieved from just substats. However, if you also want to add the big burst into his rotation, now he needs around 175 to 180% ER. Any less than that won't work usually. So these breakpoints are extremely crucial to consider. It's also important that he has access to particles, preferably electro particles coming in periodically from another electro unit like Ineffa, Fischl, or Cookie. Sure, with this team, Orange just catches particles himself, but on second rotation onwards, it wouldn't be possible for Flins to start with another big burst. In fact, his Big Burst, even with Ineffa or Fischl or Cookie, or basically anyone who generates particles over time, it's still not enough to do it every rotation. You can see the breakpoints here, but basically, with 175% or so ER, you could trigger Big Burst every third rotation or so. And to trigger it more consistently, Flins would need to reach new ER requirement breakpoints. Although, here's a funny anecdote. When he's equipped with Favonius Lance, he can trigger Big Burst pretty much every rotation, since he can gain those white particles twice. Although, of course, his damage when you look at the numbers will be lower. Finally, you might be wondering, which one is better then? The 2 mini bursts or the triple burst playstyle of both using Big Burst and the 2 mini bursts? Well, the answer is, obviously first rotation with Big Burst will be better, but because you have to start sacrificing other stats to achieve high ER, his damage will also suffer. But overall, both playstyles are quite balanced around each other, but I do prefer playing him in triple burst, just because for me, it's enough to swap out attack sands with ER, and he achieves that 175% ER requirement. All in all, as you can see, this guy is quite interesting, and I'm assuming most will initially just play him without the Big Burst. I mean, heck, the 2 mini bursts deliver a ton of damage already, but in long term, when you're farming for his artifacts, energy recharge substats or very strong ER sands can be a viable option to use, so you can then play his triple burst playstyle every rotation or so. Also, I haven't mentioned his weapons yet, but I want to quickly talk about his signature for a moment. Compared to Prospectors, it's about 18% better. However, because it allows Flins to regain 12 energy, he would only need 140% ER to enable the triple burst playstyle, which can be done with about 8 energy recharge substat rolls. And then, this weapon becomes like nearly 30% stronger, or you can also just ignore the triple burst playstyle, and with 0 ER substat rolls, this weapon is still enough for him to play the 2 mini bursts consistently. Safe to say, this is a very powerful weapon on him. And yeah, his overall damage with any of these weapons is really impressive, obviously thanks to those massive Lunar-Charged hits he delivers. But yeah, now let's talk about his teammates and loadouts more in this next part. Okay, so I won't be spending too much time here, and instead I'll provide a brief overview, and then on release day, I will publish Flynn's guide video and go through every single teammate along with their pros and cons and damage potential, among many other things. So be sure to subscribe to my channel. Anyway, let's talk about the archetype first. Any team you build, you'll always want it to have a Hydro unit to enable Lunar-Charged, then another Electro unit so that they can provide Flins with energy, and then the last slot is where the support unit lives. Now, currently, his strongest team consists of C6 Ino, Ineffa, and Sucrose. Ino should be on Noblesse set, Ineffa on Serenade, and Sucrose, of course, should use VV set, plus Thrilling Tales to give a massive attack boost for Flins. This team outputs a massive amount of damage, and Ineffa also ends up contributing about 30% of team's total damage, while the rest of it is basically Flins. But what if you don't have Ineffa? How bad is the situation then? Well, on average, Ineffa improves team DPS by about 20% compared to other second best options. And more importantly, her shielding provides that crucial damage mitigation, because if you don't have Ineffa, then chances are you'll need to play Ino, who is given away for free, and then you could, I guess, use Cookie or Dory for healing instead, or swap out Sucrose with Lanyan for shielding. But Sucrose is like the best support for Flins, because even if we compare her to C0R1 Shilonen, the damage is still lower by about 10%, since Shilonen's resistance shred is smaller, while her damage percent buffs from Signature and Cinder City barely matter to Flins. You could also potentially use Lauma to enable Flins, but in a team like Xingqiu, Cookie, and Lauma, sure, Hyper Blooms provide additional damage, and Cookie can sometimes snack some Hyper Blooms, but they won't be able to critical hit because of how Lauma's passive works with 2 or more Nod-Krai units, and in endgame content, you're just better off using Lauma in either Nilobloom or other Hyper Bloom teams without Flins. She's not the worst support for Flins, but I just use Ino instead. Speaking of which, let's talk about Hydro options quickly. If you have Ineffa, then there's a plethora of Hydro units to choose from, all of which are actually strong enough to compete with C6 Ino because, at the end of the day, C6 Ino is like a few percent better than other Hydro options. For example, I found this interesting team of Farina, where she won't even need to trigger her burst, so just give her something like Tenacity Artifact Set and Favonius Sword, and then if you have Staff of Homa, Flins will stay at 50% HP constantly, and will enable the weapon's passive to the fullest, which actually ends up as a second strongest weapon option for Flins. You could possibly equip him with Hunter's set, but there would need to be a healer in the team to keep his HP fluctuating, but swapping out Sucrose for Anemo Healer is just not viable, so I'd still use Nod-Krai's set instead. Besides that, other good Hydro options would be Elan, mostly because she can contribute a fair bit of her personal damage, although her damage percent buff doesn't really matter to Flins, or you could go for Mona, since she can equip Thrilling Tales, and some of her constellations boost Lunar-Charged and critical rate. Otherwise, there's Kokomi or Barbara, both ending up useful on the same level. And then, get this, you could also use Sigewinne. I'm sure all 12 people watching this will be happy to hear it. But yeah, if you don't have Ineffa, then as I've shown before, a team like Auroran, Ino, and Sucrose is perfectly fine. C6 Auroran ends up improving damage by roughly 7 to 9% compared to C0, but even with just a full C0 team and Prospector Shovel, this comp still slaps really hard. I also tried out Iansan, who was C6, meaning her C4 can help with maintaining her attack buff a bit easier, but as you can see, after swapping to Flins, it constantly shifts between weaker and stronger attack buff state, even as I'm running around like a madman with him. So while she kind of works, it's hard to maintain her buff on Flins, unless I'm missing something. Finally, I also want to quickly give a shout out to Chever's Overload team. If you go up against enemies with innate Hydro Aura, you won't need a Hydro unit. So against Hydro Tulpa here, with Chevy, Benny, and Ineffa, Flins ends up dealing almost 600k damage Lunar-Charged crit from his big burst, so a pretty funny team you can use against Hydro enemies specifically. Overall, even if he only has one true team archetype, it's pretty clear that Ino, whether she's C0 or C6, is perfectly fine to use with another Electro unit if you don't have Ineffa. Sure, the damage will be lower, but not as a dramatic drop as you would experience when using Skirk without Escoffier. And then as for the last support slot, hopefully you understand by now how powerful Sucrose is for Flins. Her rotation is literally just press skill button and swap out, and he gains a ton of elemental mastery, a massive attack buff from Thrilling Tales, and of course, the enemy's Hydro and Electro resistance will be shredded. If you are struggling to survive without a healer, even if Flins does have a lot of iframes when using mini bursts, you could instead use Lanyan for shielding or Shilonen for healing, but Sucrose still remains the best support. So, what do I think about Kirill Chudomirovich Flins? Honestly, I love the fact how balanced it feels to either go for mini bursts or triple burst playstyle. It might seem daunting at first how his energy needs need to be managed, but in reality, he just needs a lot more energy than usual, and if you reach that cap, he can start using triple burst playstyle, even if it won't happen on every rotation, but every third rotation is already pretty good in my books. There's also the fact he only needs Night Sky's artifact set, Prospector Shovel, and 3 4-star units to reach very high damage output. So I would consider him to be quite free-to-play friendly to pull for. I haven't really talked about his constellations, but for those of you who didn't pull for Ineffa and would still want him to perform on a similar level with Ineffa, the fix is that you can get his first constellation, which ends up being about as good as having Ineffa on team. Now, it is a bit of a bummer he doesn't have any other artifact set that can reach Night Sky's similar potential, but if you will pull for him and you still don't have this set, you can just use Gilded Dreams or 2-piece of EM or attack. It's also important to know that he doesn't have any kind of exploration ability. Some of you who have been used to Natlan units vehicles that allow for speedy exploration might make him feel slower in the world, but I personally found his front-loaded damage from the first mini burst to be excellent at clearing enemies immediately, and he's also pretty fast at farming any of the domains in Nod-Krai. I guess the last thing worth talking about would be the lack of other Nod-Krai units in the game. This of course will change over time as more of them get released, but for now, the basic idea is that you use Ino to help enable Flins, and then if you have Ineffa, she empowers him further. Lauma is better utilized in other teams, but can work with him decently enough. All in all, I consider him to be a pretty strong DPS. He can definitely compete with other top Natlan units like Veressa, especially if you use his premium team and or signature, which then turns him into a beast. But even with the free-to-play team comp and weapon, he still outputs insane amount of damage. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I will be publishing Flynn's full guide the moment his banner is live. There's still a lot I need to work on, and it will be a very detailed guide. So yeah, hit the like button on this video to help with YouTube's algorithm, and I'll see you very soon.